is going to talk about something which we are struggling to understand, how technology, and how good are we at doing this? Is there something unique to the way we do things which will allow us to compete more fiercely in the marketplace? So I'm not going to get between you and the speakers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves. At the end of each speakers, you can have Q&A. We will have the first two speakers, we'll have a short break, and then we'll come back for the next two. So please hold your questions. At the end of each talk, you can ask the speaker your questions, and then we'll go on to the next one. Thank you, so Anant.
Okay, thank you, Sridhar. Welcome again. Sort of one of the things I noticed that before any people from industry who really know what's going on speak, us academics are put in front of them. So what you can think of is we generate hypotheses, and then they get to ask the question as to, well, was this hypothesis worth making? Do I believe in it? A whole bunch of things. So in case you have very interesting questions, continue to ask the exact same questions to the person following me. So that'll be a good strategy. First thing, this is work that Sridhar and I have been doing. And before I talk about the details of what we did, I also want to talk about the process by which this came about. As you'll see, a lot of what I'm talking about are based on two papers, one involving Harita, who's here, who's finished her PhD and is a postdoc here at ISB, and the other involved Karthik Balakrishnan, who was a TA here at ISB. So you'll notice that this is all work which was done with phone calls, which sort of we received at midnight, and which were done here during the day. So this was it was a wonderful example of things going around the clock. So while Karthik worked during the nights here, and we worked during the day, so it was a perfect, appropriate sort of system. So now, one of the things that is sort of interesting about this is, in addition to the details of this study, we're hoping to make the case that there is room for using data sets in India to try to formulate hypotheses, figure out what the methodology tells us, and then follow it up with meetings in industry, talking to people, etc. So we get a much better picture as to what is going on in the industry. This is, again, as Sridhar said, this is our first cut. We've done about 3 papers in this area over the last year, and each one gives us a sort of a slightly more nuanced view as to what is going on in the industry, we hope. So again, here are the sources. As professors, what we do is we like to tell the world everything we do, and so these are papers that are written and out there. So in case you find what I'm presenting to be too brief, there are very detailed versions of these things. Just a quick outline. One of the things we're focusing on, unlike the focus yesterday that Sumantran had on finished autos, our focus is on auto components. Now, the moment I say that, you could immediately jump up and ask questions saying, you know, is there money to be made? Do we care about auto components, or do we care about cars? You know, where do we get this? As far as we're concerned, we think what is booming in terms of volume is auto components. And the sourcing question, in many cases, is a component story, even though there are completed cars which are part of the story. It's also the case that in studying this industry, as Sridhar mentioned, about 1.5 years ago, when both of us have been coming here to teach at ISB various electives, and one of the things you'll notice that beyond the class time, we sort of wander around and try to figure out what is happening in India. And this whole Deming story is a very interesting story. As I think Udayan mentioned yesterday, and a few people mentioned yesterday, there have been about a total of 13 firms in India that have won the Deming Prize. And this is remarkable because it's the largest number outside of Japan. And one of the things we've been curious about is what is really happening? Is there a big role being played by so-called Japanese production techniques, etc.? So some of that is part of the mix in understanding this industry. There is a database, and so we'll talk a little bit about the database. And anytime you have data, notice the problem didn't end, it just started, because there is a methodology to understand that data. And why is that important? Well, there's a whole slew of people around the world for over, at least 100 years who've been saying that methodology matters and care matters and how you interpret the data. So from our perspective, we'll tell you very briefly, I'll just use a picture to give you an idea of the methodology. Now, when you have data and a methodology, the questions, really what matters are the questions. And the questions get formulated in the form of hypotheses. So we'll give you a few snapshots of things we've tested and some conclusions. And in fact, if you think about what stimulated all this, when Sridhar was describing the journey, which is about 1.5 years old at least, some of this is sort of coming from the fact that when we go visit these facilities that are Deming Award-winning facilities. Now, many of us have got our degrees. I mean, Sridhar got his in IIT Madras, my degree was in IIT Bombay, and we've all done internships when you do your engineering. And I don't remember any plant that looked like the plants we see when you go here. There's an incredible transformation. In fact, one could argue that everything we teach in class shows up in that plant next to each machine. That's quite remarkable. The fact that there is so much information online that is potentially being put to use to manage manufacturing really means that the word manufacturing is different. It's not just making things, but it's making, controlling, modifying, etc. So all of this is exciting, and that's the reason for the fact that you'll see us hanging around here for various points in time. So what's special about this industry? Just some of these are numbers which, from your perspective, you might say, I knew that, but it's useful to know. First, the global industry for auto components is about $737 billion. And the Indian industry for 2003, there's a little increase in 2004, is about $7 billion. So in terms of a percent, you can say this is small potatoes. This is very small. However, what gets everybody's attention is the growth rate. There's such a huge growth rate here that anytime you do any finance, you clearly understand that compounding matters. So notice that this is a big deal. This could be a big deal in a hurry. And in addition, exports are a big fraction of this growth. Exports are about 10 to 14% of the market, which is a significant number. Now, when one thinks about the auto industry, of course, there are sort of the OEMs, and one thinks of that, and so Tata's, and certainly GM, Ford, Toyota, Hyundai, etc. There's a replacement market that is a large portion of the demand, and there's the export market. So here's some numbers. For example, you can see that in 03-04, it was about 13.1% of the total. And there are various people who've been exporting these cars. And what is interesting is that I don't think this is something that we would have anticipated a few years ago, that there'd be so much export. It's something that's actually quite significant. When you export a component, you're just making that component and selling it. Yes, it's part of the system of the innards of that component. But when you're making a car, it's a much bigger deal. You're putting together a more complex system. And the fact that you can consistently put together a complex system and people are willing to put their brand name on it really means something to the industry. And I think that is quite significant. What we also find, which is quite interesting, is that close on the heels of Maruti is Hyundai. So one of our theses is that really a lot of the success in the Indian auto industry is really a Korean story. It's a story of Hyundai being very successful in leveraging the Indian market, pushing exports, and making public statements that they're going to get out of the small car manufacturing and move that into India. One of the things that we've been trying to do through various contacts, our perspective is we want to study India, but we want to study India within a global perspective. So, for example, when we have affiliate universities in Korea, and we tell them, look, there is a Korean story in India, and they say, there is? And we say, yeah, there is, and this is what it is. So, in fact, what is interesting is, from an academic side, what started off as a Deming, which we start studying, morphs into things people tell us about Korea. Well, then we'll chase Korea and understand. You'll see that we're sort of vagabonds. Okay? Now, one thing when we start looking at the export of cars is you might say, well, so what if people export cars? They bring down knockdown parts, they assemble it and send it out. So who cares? No, and a lot of this data is purely from Google searches of articles pulled together, etc., to create this table. When we created this table, what was interesting is the percent of local content. So now, of course, Jeff can back me up on this when he comes here, but it was quoted that when the GM Travera hit the market in May of 2004, it had an 85% local content. Ford Icon is a 90% local content. The Hyundai Santro is 90%. These are very big numbers, and I think these are numbers which suggest that it's not just that knockdown parts are coming in that are being put together. There's more happening. There's quite a bit of confidence in the ability to create the components and assemble them. This is an interesting This is an interesting piece of the story. So again, we all know about this new phenomenon. At least for us, about a year and a half ago, this was a new phenomenon. And now, I presume a lot of people know about it. One of the things, one of the agendas we have is we want to tell our academic colleagues in the United States and in Europe that something is changing in India. Because a lot of people have missed this thing. They say, there is? You think there are some Deming firms in India? We say, no, it's the largest representation, and it has the only company that's won the Japan prize. This is something that's creditable. Now, this could also be a signal. You could sit in a corner in India and say, I'm great, come to me. But it's a lot different when somebody says, there's a Japan Union of Scientists and Engineers who have certified that I'm very good. So now I need to manage time a little bit, so I'm going to either talk faster or move through the slides a little fast. This just gives you, as a background information, the companies that have won this award. The key thing to note with this is that the bulk of the companies, about 7 to 8 of them, are in the auto components industry. One can start looking at the location of the companies and how things diffused, etc. But that's what has happened. One of the problems when you talk about awards are, we all get a little cynical about awards after a while. Now, I'm not putting down the IT industry, but if you really start talking about CMM level 5, I've had various students in class here at ISB who say, okay, I know how to get CMM level 5. Here's what you do. Here's the strategy. Now, one would worry whether that happens in this case too. The little difference here is that there is a completely independent external body that does an independent audit. And some of it shows up in the form of delivered improvements. You see significant reductions in rework, first pass yield improvements, warranty improvements, etc. So given all this background, so what do we professors do? Because the first part is something that you would tell if you're giving a talk to our alumni, general will do it. So what do we do as professors? One of the things we're curious about is, well, what's been happening in the industry? What's happening with respect to productivity? Is it the case that the quality award winners outperform the industry on productivity measures? Was better quality rewarded by the marketplace? Did exports play a role in improving quality? In other words, there was a remark yesterday regarding Japan which says if it's bad quality, export it. But hopefully it's not the case here. We want to ask, if you want to be in the export business, does that mean you've got to improve your quality? And is there a difference between winning an award versus getting a certification? Because what you could also look at is getting certified. And there's name your favorite brand of ISO. There's 9000, 9001, 14000, etc. All of those things. What's the data? Now, again, we've got to be very careful about the data set. In India, thankfully, regardless of your qualms regarding the source, there are lots of data sets that have been studying these things and keeping this over time. One of this is the Prowess database, and it's available here at ISB, which is one of the things that you find here. The digital library here has a fascinating collection of data sets, and we've been encouraging them to get a lot more of this for 2 reasons. A, if we reveal that we're sitting in a US university, the prices go up dramatically. It's like getting into the Taj Mahal. If you say I'm Indian, it's $10, otherwise it's $1,000. So, so we make use of the price arbitrage. The other thing is there are wonderful students here. There are great, we have Harita here, Karthik, etc., who've been eager to get involved. In terms of our input variables, we've looked at how much raw material, labor, capital, etc. are inputs into this process. The output is net total income, and then we've got to do some deflation to see to it. Here I'm going to go a little briskly. One of the things, though I'm going to make a little bit of a case for the methodology. One of the methodologies that's available out there is called DEA, or Data Envelopment Analysis. And what it basically does is it says that how do you take a data set and you realize that individual firms have their own process of converting inputs to outputs. So how do you not take a common format for everybody, but take into account the individual ability to put together the inputs to come up with the output? For those not particularly aware of this, all this does is it allows each individual firm to choose the optimal mix weights of inputs in coming up with the output. So in some sense, you're saying that I've given the best shot to each firm to measure its productivity. In that sense, not knowing exactly what they're using is, in any case, just overstating what they would be doing. The other thing we want to do is track productivity change, and we want to try to separate the sources of the productivity, and as it says there, skip methodology details. So all I'm going to do is go to this picture. In fact, if I could get you to appreciate this picture, a lot of what we want to communicate would happen. Now, think about this as, so I want to switch to my professor mode for just a few minutes. Think about the x-axis as inputs you put in, and take all the inputs and weight them. So this is now a weighted input on the x-axis. On the y-axis, it is output. So we have some measure of output. And for now, forget about, even if you forgot what I mentioned a few slides ago, don't worry about it. Think about these lines as frontiers. So a frontier is you can sit anywhere in the frontier, and it's a different choice of input to output to get productivity. Now, one way to look at productivity is to look at a point in time. You say, how far are you from the frontier? If you're on the frontier, you've got an efficiency of 1. If you're away from the frontier, you're less efficient. In other words, if you're away from the frontier, it is possible to make some changes in your system to move towards the frontier and improve productivity. The key idea here, and this is methodology that Rajiv Banker, who's also been visiting here at ISB various times, has focused on this methodology. And what he basically says is, look, when you look at productivity changes, it's important to identify where that change is coming from. And what does that mean? He says, at a point in time, you've got to ask the question, how far am I from the frontier? And that's a valid question.